right, it's 6 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Third Thursday. We'll start off by getting a greeting or a hello from your MRA National President, Allison Sheets.
Thanks, Carrie, and welcome to Third Thursday. I really don't have much to say other than to encourage you all to participate in the conference coming up in Flagstaff. Hopefully a lot of you here have registered for that. That'll be a fun time. It'll be good to see everybody and hang out and do some cool pre-conference events. Also, we'll be voting on 2 positions for the MRA on the business meeting on Sunday following the regular conference. We'll be voting in a new secretary treasurer and a member at large. So think about that. I don't have nominations announced yet from our past president, but I will try to get that out a week or so before the conference. And then finally, about Third Thursday, I just wanted to give a shout out to the team that's been putting these together, Carrie, Eva, Sophia, Charlie in the background, and all the participants that have been giving these great presentations. I'm in the middle of a busy work week, and it's nice to just like, okay, I've got an hour of something that's going to be more productive than cat videos, and I might actually get to see some of my friends on the screen and learn something new and make myself a better rescuer. So thanks, Sam, for coming. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Carrie.
Thank you. So this evening, we're focusing on fitness and search and rescue. And our presenter this evening is Sam Naney. Sam grew up in the North Cascades of Washington, and by his teenage years had quickly risen in the national junior ranks as a Nordic ski racer. After competing at Dartmouth College and later for many years on the U.S. professional circuit, he helped launch the coaching business Uphill Athlete with his mentor and former ski coach, Scott Johnson, and climber Steve House, and ultimately served as Uphill Athlete's director of coaching. In 2021, he left Uphill Athlete and returned to the business he and his wife founded, Cascade Endurance. They provide remote endurance coaching for all manner of mountain athletes, as well as regional events, camps, and clinics in the Pacific Northwest. He lives in Mazama, Washington, with his wife, Allison, his 2 daughters, Fiona and Izzy, and his Siberian Huskies, Rocket and Stella. Welcome to Third Thursday, Sam. The floor is yours. And just a reminder, sorry, all questions, post them in the chat. We'll get to those at the end. Thank you.
Oh, thank you guys. Yeah, thank you for having me. Hopefully, so what I hope to do tonight is sort of lay out sort of the thinking behind how you can approach as a mountain rescuer your fitness and training, both in terms of aerobic endurance and strength, in ways that can really support your ability to be a more capable rescuer, and then as well in any of the pursuits that you enjoy chasing around recreationally when you're not out there saving people's lives and such. So I'm going to try to distill down what is ultimately obviously really big topics into 30 or 40 minutes, and again also make it as tailored as possible to the work that you all do. But then certainly, as Carrie said, there'll be time afterward for questions, and I can talk about this stuff all night. So don't hesitate. But I'll get started here. I'm going to jump right to a presentation, and we'll get going. Okay. So the idea behind thinking about training for mountain rescue professionals can be considered in many similar veins as training for mountaineering, training for other endurance pursuits, because if we're thinking about the objectives that you all as rescue professionals are going after, oftentimes they are many hours long. You're limited in terms of your access to resources, full meals, things like that. You're having to rely on a lot of your aerobic systems and the strengths that you've built up. So the way I will think about working with athletes and individuals who are themselves mountain rescue professionals is to think of it in terms of an ultra endurance athlete, essentially, and how we can tailor training and the ways in which you prepare yourself for this stuff in similar ways as another sort of ultra endurance athlete. So started to answer this, but why train for mountain rescue? It's a question. It's a question that we'll sometimes get from other capacities. Why train for climbing versus just going and doing climbing? The idea that we try to really hone in on in terms of why train in general is to think about any pursuit that you're going after, and in this case, in rescue scenarios, oftentimes, again, many hours long, what you're attempting to do is draw together many different components of your physical and overall physiologic capabilities, and you're trying to pull all of them together, each individual one as honed as it can be, pulling them all together into one complete package that you can use to be an effective and competent rescuer. And so thinking about how you can prepare each of those capacities, that physical durability, again, for the objectives that you might be going after. If you are part of a swift water rescue unit versus a high angle versus, many of these other realms of mountain rescue, thinking about what the requirements of each of those things are, and then in turn thinking about how you can train them and their component parts. So there's that physical aspect, and then what that can do ultimately, and what we talk about a lot, is developing a buffer, right? So it's what we want is to develop your fitness such that you have what you need to accomplish the objective, and then an amount on top of that to support the unforeseen, and to just ensure that at whatever level that you're performing, you have this additional capacity on top of that to maintain mental and emotional composure, to have the cognitive capabilities. You're in a really dynamic, austere environment, being able to have situational awareness of what's going on, how to adapt to changes, and then more broadly, thinking about all of us as athletes and wanting to be doing this stuff for a long time into later life, thinking about how we can pursue this training and a fitness program that can support aging into the, and maintaining your activity and your participation in these activities, and as a rescuer for many years. So supporting your joints and maintaining a really good aerobic capacity and metabolism. So there's a couple of things when we think about training. It's good to distinguish what we talk about with training versus exercise. And granted, I'm using this as capital T, capital E. And what is useful here is to think that training is intentional. It's looking at a target objective or a mission or a hypothetical mission, and thinking about what are the things that you need to do to get there, and then building from that idea a progressive approach. Again, working first from those different components. You have your strength that can cover a myriad topics, your aerobic capacity, your technical skills, and those things which are required for you to accomplish the task, and working on each of those individual things, again, building toward that specific target. In contrast, largely in contrast, the idea of exercising in this context has more to do with sort of more spontaneous recreation. You can certainly maintain a pretty decent level of fitness by having just going out on a bike ride when the day is nice, taking off for a run on another day. The big distinction is there's not necessarily a plan. And in many cases that can work well for a while. The benefit of training is that it helps you mark improvements and think about what that long-term goal is. It also gives you some accountability to maintaining, for instance, appropriate intensities on different days, right? Keeping an easy effort easy so that 2 days later you can really tackle that harder workout with good energy systems, instead of sort of going somewhat hard all the time, which we are often all victims of or susceptible to. So again, I think it's laying the groundwork for this conversation. Training, it doesn't necessarily need to be considered a much significant higher level, it's really just about intention. And so thinking about what are the ways in which you can be intentional with the time, often limited time that you have to build your fitness. And in that vein, there's a concept that's really helpful to be thinking about, which is the idea of specificity. You get good at what you do. A good physical therapist friend of mine uses that phrase, which I think is quite apt. So again, not being specific to the task can still be, there's benefit to be drawn from that. So the trail runner who does a lot of cycling, obviously there's still benefits that you're going to get out of that. Cycling is still going to benefit you from a general aerobic capacity. There's, sometimes a benefit to, for instance, not having the impact of running. But ultimately, if you're training to be a runner, or you're training to be a climber or a mountaineer, spending all your time on a bicycle is not going to develop those necessary systems in a specific manner. And so it's really important that we want to look at when you're planning out your approach, this, the idea of training for your tasks, for who you are as a mountain rescuer and as an athlete, maximizing when possible the specificity. And thinking about when you're using those non-specific activities, they can still have a good purpose, right? So cycling can be a great way to, again, get off the feet a little bit and not have impact, or log more total volume as you're building your capacity to do longer hikes or runs or something like that. But thinking about how it will be important to use specificity in your training when possible, so that your body is learning the movements, it's learning the ranges of motion in your joints that are actually going to be employed when you're doing the thing. So again, some of this will be pretty simplified or distilled down, but we're going to talk about aerobic capacity, because I use that term a lot. And for those of you, I'm sure many of you are attentive and participating with endurance sports and reading a lot of the literature that's out there. This is a pretty popular and commonplace term, the idea of aerobic capacity. But it is really foundational and critical. And essentially, it's your body's ability to produce ATP, which is that ultimate energy that we use through, with oxygen and predominantly through fat oxidation. So using this fuel source that we all, even the leanest of the lean people have an abundance of, and being able to use it efficiently. And that, really aerobic capacity is about thinking about economy and being able to go the fastest, and fast can occupy a lot of different things, with the least amount of energy output, so that you can do the thing that you need to do and retain, again, that idea of the buffer of capacity. If in contrast you are maybe limited aerobically, and so anytime you go out and say hiking, and we've all probably at one point in our lives or more experienced this, you get started on a hike or a trail run and you feel like you're automatically breathing hard, and you're sort of up at this operating level, like, well, I can do this, I can sustain for an hour, maybe two, but that's my capacity. That is ultimately quite limiting if you're thinking about a demand of needing to be out for 5 hours. How are you going to be able to stretch that finite amount of energy and move at the pace that you need to move, whether for the mission or for a recreational objective, in a sustainable way? And so the idea with aerobic capacity, the concept of aerobic capacity and how your aerobic system can be developed is giving you that breadth. It's giving you the capacity, metabolically and otherwise, to use fuel really efficiently to accomplish larger and larger tasks. And there's a lot of, when we talk about athletes who are more explicitly speed objective, so speed focused, and competitive athletes and otherwise, aerobic capacity plays an equally large role, because the athletes who have the greater aerobic capacity and can perform their tasks more aerobically are going to be able to go farther, and they're going to be able to do it faster. So just briefly, like the really easy example is if you pay attention to road marathon running, the fastest road marathon men and women are running, a 2:15 marathon, predominantly in an aerobic state, because that duration demands it. But they're so muscularly powerful, and their aerobic capacity is so large that they can do that. They can run that fast and be utilizing fuel in a way that is far more efficient than us mere mortals can do. So again, that's sort of the upper end, the high end of this concept spectrum, but it's something we can all benefit greatly from, of again learning how to train, and it's training at lower intensity. It's intentionally keeping your efforts moderated, so that system has the ability to develop. It needs to develop in a space of low to moderate stress on the body in order to make these gains. So how do you train it? Started to touch on that there. There are a number of different ways that you can identify sort of what your own personal aerobic capacity or your aerobic zones are. I and many other coaches are a big fan of using heart rate training. Monitoring your heart rate it's not perfect, but it is currently, sort of our best way to view a proxy of what is going on physiologically while you are exercising, while you're training. And I should note, when I say measuring heart rate, using a heart rate chest strap. So most sport watches now come with the feature of measuring heart rate at the wrist. Unfortunately, even with all of our technology, it's still not very accurate. Those wrist monitors, I think in part it's so distal from the heart when the watch is on your wrist. So and many of you have probably seen, if you try to keep an eye on your heart rate when you're exercising, especially vigorously, it tends to get a bit erratic. So if you are trying to measure heart rate and use heart rate in your training, use a chest strap, which most watches can comply with. So we use this concept of the aerobic threshold, which is approximately the physiological marker that represents a shift from majority fat burning into majority carbohydrate burning. So if we think about a higher percentage of fat burning or fat oxidation as being more of an aerobic zone, and as you increase your carbohydrate utilization, you're getting more into an anaerobic zone, and it's a much more finite fuel source, and it has some other factors that can eventually increase fatigue. So we want to think about defining that aerobic threshold, that juncture for each individual, and then you're going to go out and spend a lot of time training around that aerobic threshold. It's going to be 80 to 90% of your total duration of training in order to really effectively build this capacity. There are a number of different ways you can find that threshold, all the way from going to a physiological lab. Many colleges and universities have these. There are a lot of there are increasing number of private labs that you can go and spend several $100s, and they'll actually measure your expired air and your inspired air and create these ratios that tell you where that crossover, that juncture occurs between carb and fat. We've also you can do it quite a bit more easily than that. The number many years ago, in fact, a physiologist and physician named Phil Maffetone defined what he called the maximal aerobic function, and essentially a formula based on a very large data set that he had of 180 minus your age, and that number is represented as a heart rate, and it corresponds pretty darn well to your aerobic threshold. If anything, it tends to be a bit conservative for people, which ultimately is okay. So if you're 40 years old, then that would consider your math number, or alternatively your aerobic threshold, to be around 140 beats per minute. And those are useful starting points to ensure that you're operating in that good aerobic zone. Another concept that we've used that can be helpful is the idea of nose breathing, which I don't recommend doing all the time. It's not very productive, but you can use it as a marker. Go out, start hiking, start jogging lightly, and then just close your mouth and breathe through your nose, like a 2 count in, 2 count out, comfortable breathing through your nose. Do that for a few minutes and see what your heart rate is. And that can also be a decent correlation with your aerobic threshold. Again, I'm not advocating always going out and training nose breathing. I think that's been taken to a large extent right now in some of the popular training media, but it can be another tool that you can use to correlate an aerobic threshold. So there are a number of different ways that you can find that heart rate, but the most important thing is to use a method, try to define that heart rate for you, and then use that for the majority of your sessions. When you're heading out for a hike, for a trail run, for a bike ride, try not to exceed that heart rate. And what you'll find is you gradually increase the frequency and the duration of those sessions using that heart rate. That is what's going to build your capacity. It's going to, again, give your body the room to develop the volume and the economy of movement without a constant barrage of stress that would otherwise come from training at higher intensities. And then finally, whenever we're talking about training, and this will be true when I shift into talking about strength training as well, but certainly for aerobic training and as you get into intensity, is making sure that you're balancing load and recovery. And this is an equally important concept as the principle of specificity, that what we're trying to do with training is to balance loading up your body with measured stresses, and then giving it space to recover from those stresses, and what it will, if they're applied correctly, and if the subsequent recovery is applied appropriately, you'll see an adaptation. And so it's a really straightforward concept that we see all across the sciences, where when you apply a stress on something, provided it's not a stress that breaks it, including our own bodies, then the resultant compensation should be a little bit stronger than where you started. And that's in a nutshell what we try to do with training. So adding in recovery days, adding in rest days, then ultimately listening to what your body needs. If you're doing a lot of low intensity exercise, you might be able to go many days without taking a full day off. You might be feeling good. You don't have undue soreness. Your appetite remains good. Your mood remains good. Then you can keep going. But being able to perceive and listen to those markers that we all have, particularly when we have full lives, jobs, families, stresses. I think this is important. This is a particularly important concept for rescue professionals, for military operators, for a lot of folks whom we work with, and as well as mountain athletes in general. Quite often, the environments that you're working in have themselves a significant level of stress that gets applied, and it's impossible to extricate those environmental stresses from the physiologic stresses that you're applying. They all combine on the body. And so it's, and again, I see this working with athletes. Sometimes they'll kind of hope that the training can operate in a bubble and isolated from everything else in their life. And they just kind of keep plugging away at the training plan. And despite the fact that, they're not sleeping because they have a sick kid, or they have stress at work, or you went on a really challenging all-night mission that applied a lot of stress, all of those things need to be taken into account when you're determining how to recover and how to rest and treat your body well in the long term. And a lot of that is keeping track, even writing down and logging your day to day and how you're feeling, giving yourself a score each day on your restedness or your fatigue, having somebody objective, a friend, a spouse, a coach, whomever, who can, whom you can bounce those reflections off of, and they can give you some feedback on, hey, you've had a pretty big couple of days. I think it's good. Let's back off now before the wheels fall off, that sort of thing. So being attentive to that as you start approaching more rigorous training, higher volume of aerobic work and such is going to be critical. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to try to move through some of these concepts. Obviously, we could spend hours and hours talking about aerobic, but I'm going to move on now to a piece that I think is really critical for anybody who is an athlete. Whether you are a rescue professional, a runner, a cyclist, strength and conditioning athlete, and that is mobility. It's something that for a long time was paid perhaps a little bit of lip service, but it's a critical piece to being an athlete, which is the ability for you to operate your joints in as wide a full range of motion as possible. And this is going to tie into our strength concepts we're going to talk about in a bit, and the functionality of a given muscle and its strength being really directly correlated to strength through its range of motion. Mobility is the reason it's so important is that is because in absence of mobility, you end up getting stuck in the range of motion for which of the thing that you do. And I'll take running as an example, or just footborne movement, hiking or running. You're upright, it's bipedal. There's a lot of positive things about that develop strength, that can develop decent range of motion, but there's not a lot of lateral movement, right? There's not a tremendous amount of flexion, deep flexion in the hips and in the knees for a lot of the time. And when we think about runners or hikers who start to develop issues in the knees and the hips, the limitations that come up there, that in a normal gait, again, hiking or running, you're only going to get a certain degree of flexion in those joints. But if you start stressing them by moving really quickly downhill and getting into a more flexed position to absorb those loads, or if you have to do some movement, whether bending over and lifting, or something that is out of the range of those motions that you're used to doing, suddenly those tendons and the muscles that you've been training in running and hiking are at the end of their capacities, and they're much more prone and susceptible to injury and to tearing. And so maintaining a really good mobility regimen and attending to it from as early on as you can is critical. And this is something that, as young people, we all, vast majority of people have in spades, because young people, their bodies are naturally going to be more mobile, more limber. And as they start to get into their teenage years, as growth starts to happen, that's where things start to get a little bit tighter and more limiting. So attending to this early on is going to be really helpful. It can certainly be helped by diversifying your activities. So this not counter, but sort of complementary to that idea of specificity. We talk about specificity as being important in achieving your highest capacity in a given activity, but the balance to that is maintaining a diversity of activities gives you a diversity of ranges of motion and different movements, and that's really helpful. One of the easiest, or a few of the easiest ways to sort of tackle your mobility day to day, it's just 5 to 10 minutes of active dynamic movements. This can be in your home before or after a session, thinking about each joint and what its full range of motion is, and just moving it through that. It doesn't need to be under any load. In fact, it's better if it's not. But paying particular attention to our hips. Our hips there's a lot of leverage. There's a lot of forces that move through our hips, and they often are the culprit for lower leg injuries, overuse and otherwise. Those you can often trace the origin to limitations and restrictions in the hips. So thinking about working into seated, squats and different deep squats and movements will help improve that range of motion. Yoga is obviously really great for this. Other similar, stretching, flexibility type activities. But I put this first before I start talking about strength, because this is the necessary precursor. We tend to want to gravitate directly to a gym and putting plates on a bar and jacking big weights and feeling strong and powerful. But that, building strength on an inflexible frame is just asking for breakage down the road. So the mobile athlete is going to be a strong athlete. The flexible athlete is a strong athlete. And so attending to this first will be really valuable in the long run. Okay, so strength. And I put here, strength is pretty much everything. And what I mean by that is that if you look at any activity and what you're doing in activity, it can be tied to strength. If you are a hiker, you are employing strength to do that activity. If you are a 100-yard dash, 100-meter sprinter, that speed that you employ to run 100 meters really quickly is a form of strength. It's the ability, it's the power that you can generate through a given range of motion of a given joint using those muscles. And so when we think about strength, you want to think about it equally broadly. Think about the movements that you're doing. When you think about, and I think this is where it's really fun and interesting when you're conceiving of the training and the preparations you might do as a rescue professional. Think about the challenges that you're going to be presented with on a mission. If you're part of a high angle team and you're doing a lot of fixed line work, if you're moving a litter over rough terrain, those ranges of motion, bending over, crouching, pulling from that bent position, holding in that position, and moving over rough terrain, those are all, if you can picture the demands that you're going to have on that given mission, and then unpeel that, work them backward, and think, how can you replicate some of those demands, some of those movements in a semi-specific way, in a gym setting, right? And try to train them ultimately under load. So we start again at the previous slide with mobility. If you know that as part of a high angle team, for instance, you're going to have to be spending a lot of time bent over at the waist or crouching down or moving sort of in torsional ways, you want to make sure that you're doing mobility work outside of those mission times that helps open up those movements so that the first time you're having to do them isn't in a mission environment, in a high stress environment where you're lifting and loading and others are reliant on you. So the precursor again is mobility. And then what we effectively do is start adding load to those motions to again, stress the system to create an adaptation. And so what I write here is thinking about prioritizing functional movements, open chain, dynamic, particularly I think for so many of the activities that you all are doing, whether on a mission or recreationally, you're training one-legged activities. Very infrequently are we as mountain athletes and mountain professionals doing a tremendous amount of lifting, standing squarely on 2 feet, right? There's a benefit to doing things like squats and deadlifts because they can train those big prime mover muscles. And that would be a non-specific, but a very beneficial strength exercise. But what you want to do is take that strength that you develop in the squat motion and take it to something more dynamic. Take it to a single leg activity. Take it to something that employs movement, like a different movement, like a box step up. So now you're taking the strength that you've developed in those big muscles, you're putting it more, you're stressing it more one leg at a time, and you're using a vertical motion, right? So to think about these progressions. Core strength, and I'll offer some examples here in a little bit. Core strength, again, is one of those buzzword, really talked about concepts. But when I say core strength, while we all might really like the idea of having washboard abs, what I'm really thinking about is the girdle, the support structure that is deeper, the transverse abdominis muscles like the obliques, these muscles that hold your frame up, take load off of your back, and support your ability to carry loads, to carry your own frame, and to move bipedally for a long period of time. That's the real critical benefit of core strength. A little bit more, sub concepts about strength, using things like max strength, high loads with low repetition, where you're really increasing the number of what we call motor units in a given muscle to work. So it's essentially having as many players on the field as possible is the idea of max strength. So you have this capacity of work. Another one that gets a lot of attention is muscular endurance, which is essentially, as it sounds, your ability to do a given loaded movement for longer, having greater endurance. So, being able to hike uphill and maintain that load maybe with a pack on your back without running out of fuel, running into complete fatigue, training that much. And there's many different ways you can do that. So thinking about strength training in a gym-based setting, a couple of days a week, and for 30, 45 minutes can be really effective. You can get a lot of work done that way. And then again, with this idea that strength is pretty much everything, you can take that functional strength, that foundational strength that you built in a gym, and you can increase it when you head outside, when you hike uphill with weight, when you do intensity training. You're adding an additional load through that intensity onto those working muscles. That is a form of strength training. Think about all the different activities you do if you're a ski tourer and breaking trail, if you're a rock climber, certainly if you're a backpacker, a paddler, these different things which add load to those muscles beyond just moving down the trail on flat ground. Those are helping to reinforce that muscular endurance, which comes from that foundation of strength that you have. So I put here just some example ideas of how you can approach strength. Again, a multitude of strength concepts and workouts and exercises on the internet, a lot of which are great. And the fun thing about strength is that it is, if you can dream it, you can do it in some respects. It's just how and when and being thoughtful to your overall load. But I think especially starting out, and in fact for most athletes, a simple, straightforward plan can net you a lot of good. And then you can take your remaining time and go and train in ways that maybe are a bit more enjoyable, get you outside. So I'm a fan of concise, straight to the point type of strength training, not many hours in a gym. So an example regimen for someone who's been doing some training for a little while might be 2 days a week. 1 day you're using resistance, you're adding load in the form of added weights, and doing these straightforward movements like squats and single leg deadlifts, single leg activities, the standing press with a barbell or with dumbbells or kettlebells to support the shoulders, the back, and maintain that core stability. Box step ups, as I talked about, gets that single leg strength in a vertical motion, a little more dynamic and stability. But pick, a handful of exercises, 3 sets of 12 with a little bit of a warm up, and there you go. If you did that once or twice a week for a number of weeks, you will see really tremendous gains. And then similarly, adding in, a day of core strength. And this can be a session that maybe takes you 30 minutes to do, plus a little bit for warm up. And when I think about core exercises, I'm not so much thinking about thousands upon thousands of crunches. Again, training the rectus abdominis, those washboard abs, There is some functionality to it, but that is mostly a form of spinal flexion. And what we're looking for when we're training the core is stability, is being able to hold your frame. So isometric exercises like planks, and then other exercises where you're doing something dynamic, but you're holding your frame stable. So push-ups, pull-ups, windshield wipers, which is an exercise where you lay on your back and you bring your legs up to 90 degrees, and then you rotate your legs from side to side. Again, lots and lots of different options for how you can do this. But if you start from that idea of thinking about how can I engage those core muscles, that deep transverse, and load it for a period of time, that's what we're looking for with these exercises. Okay, so again, that all feels very quick and dirty talking about these big concepts, but working backward, where do you go? So you're a mountain professional. You're thinking about how you can create more structure and sustainability to your fitness and to your training. The starting point, again, if we think about that distinction of training versus exercise, is to define your objective. And again, in conventional sports, that objective might be a competition. For mountain athletes or mountain rescue professionals, that objective might be a hypothetical mission. You think about the parameters and the demands of missions you've been on in the past, or one that you can imagine coming up, and you think, okay, what might it entail? X number of hours of hiking in with this amount of weight, or a loaded litter up a given steep slope, or lowering it down off of something. So thinking about those objectives. The other things to be aware of are, what about the amount of time, right? So it might be this hypothetical mission you're using as your objective to start building training. It might be 2 hours, 3 hours of hiking in to get to a victim, but then you might have a couple of hours on site, and probably do, or many hours may, in fact. And so thinking about that part, which at a fundamental level is where aerobic capacity can really support you, because you're not expending all of your energy getting there. You have this buffer to sustain you when you're in that environment where the victim is. But taking that into account and thinking, okay, how can I simulate that circumstance when I'm out training? And that can be thinking about it in terms of nutrition. When if you're imagining a mission where you're going to hike in 2 hours and then be at a location for a period of time, then when you go out on your training hikes, bring sufficient food, complete a portion of the hike, and then think about what are the foods that I can be eating that are efficient, not a full meal, but that can just keep me going for a period of time now that I'm at this location, and then take off again and hike in a different direction. So some of it's a little bit of contrivance, but I think that's also a bit of the fun in thinking about how you can train for perhaps less conventional objectives than a 10-kilometer running race from point A to point B. So again, breaking down those components from the pack weight you anticipate carrying to the nature of the terrain you're going to be moving on. Again, specificity. If you're spending a lot of time approaching sites and victims on talus and scree, then you'd better be employing talus and scree in your training, and vertical gain and things like that. Once you've got that objective, once you have those ideas, then think about how you can make a plan. And when you're thinking about a training plan, it's very similar to if you're prone to adventure. It's fun to get out the maps and lay them on the kitchen table and start drawing lines on the maps of where you're going to go and the great things you're going to see and how fast you're going to move across the terrain. But you want to make sure to take into account all the variables that life brings. So when you're making your training plan, where's your work-life balance? What, can you actually, does it make sense to get up at 4 a.m. every morning to do 2 hours of hiking before going to work? Maybe you should curtail that a little bit. Think about something that's sustainable. Better to start at a reduced volume and then build. In many cases, when I'm coaching athletes, who are just getting started. And they'll say, well, I think I've got 45 minutes every day. That's going to be tight, but let's do it. And I'll say, how about we start with 20 minutes and then see if you can build up from there. But you want to provide yourself the space to develop. You don't want to immediately cram all of the available time with training. You also want to think about where you're currently at in terms of what you can do, strength-wise, time on feet, and not try to make a big jump right away, because that again is going to be too much stress. We want a measured amount of stress to create a measured adaptation. If you add too much stress, it will be difficult to recover from to get that adaptation. And then, finally, accountability, as I mentioned earlier. Many folks are great, and particularly I think endurance athletes and rescue professionals, we tend to be type A people. We enjoy a challenge. We enjoy pushing ourselves. More often than not, the challenge is in holding back and not doing too much, as opposed to a reluctance to get out the door and work hard. And in either case, the underperformer and the overperformer, it's really valuable to have some accountability to something, and that can just be a plan. It can be a written down plan that you've thoughtfully put together. It can also be a training group, group of your fellow team members or friends that you enjoy going out with, and sort of holding each other to account for making sure that you're keeping the effort in check on a long hike or a long run, that you're taking those rest days. Employing a coach is another great way to do that. You can measure that objectivity and that reflection back and forth from an experienced voice. And then similarly, as I said, with the plan, writing down what you do, writing down how you feel, how a given session went, how your fatigue is measuring up, and use that training log, that journal, also to note how you're feeling elsewhere. How much sleep are you getting? Is that work stress dying down? All those things, remember, get thrown into the soup, and you can't break those pieces apart and hold them in isolation, because they're all going to affect your overall physiological readiness to train and ultimately to execute missions. So that is a very tight nutshell of many of these concepts, and just my brief plug here again. With our business, we help put together training plans for athletes. We do coaching on everything from daily to periodic check-ins, as well as just having conversations with people about how they can do this stuff. So point being, there's a lot of resources out there. There's more knowledge than ever out in the landscape on how to train and prepare for these types of objectives, tactical and rescue and otherwise. So it's a great time to be an athlete and to be pursuing these goals, because there's a lot of help out there. So yeah, thank you all. That's sort of the end of my presentation. So we've got time for questions, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. The first question we have is for the step up. How high of a box?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Straightforward question. So I think, a good general rule is a little bit below the kneecap, so 16 to 18 inches. You don't want it so high that you're getting into a really acute flexion at the knee. That can, and putting undue stress through that patellar tendon. So yeah, measure it a little bit below your kneecap. And when you're doing that box step up, make sure that when you put the foot on the box, that the weight and the load is really on that forward heel, and you're effectively trying to pull yourself up onto the box using that heel, as opposed to pushing down on the toes, because you want to employ a lot of the posterior chain muscles, your hamstrings and your glutes when you do it, and be careful not to let your try to make a knee with my hands. I can't do it. You don't want the knee to drive in front of your foot. Essentially, you want to keep the knee in line or behind the foot on that forward foot.
Thank you. So the next one's a two-parter. When considering coming back from injury, how does the training plan look to get back into aerobic health if you have a normal work schedule?
Yeah. eh, many different answers, sort of depending on the nature of the injury and kind of where the athlete was at. But I'd say, thinking generally, it's you want to ease back into exercise and really think about, how can you build that foundational aerobic fitness again in a way that doesn't stress the injury. So, an easy example is if it was a running induced injury, if it's something soft tissue that is affected by impact, then allowing yourself to start rebuilding that aerobic capacity through cycling. But really easing back in, because again, you've got multiple components that need to train back up. It's not just the aerobic capacity that may have dwindled through the course of the injury. It's also the strength and the tone of the muscles and the tone of the fascia, which is the wrapping around every muscle fiber that is a really critical piece to functional movement and durability. So the very easiest answer is being gentle and operating in minimal stress, and then your body, that is what's going to gradually build back up that durability. Yeah, but that's one of those really critical pieces. It's a reason why we have coaches and physical therapists and all the rest is because when we're coming back from injury or oftentimes working with postpartum athletes or just anyone who's re-entering a training phase, our interest is in getting back to it as quickly as possible, and more often than not, restraint and gradual progression is going to pay you dividends in the long run.
Okay. And then if you are building aerobic endurance and keeping below maximum heart rate, how long should a training go?
It can go for a long time. When you're just getting started, you're generally not going to be, if you're getting started and you're operating at that, at or below that aerobic threshold, an hour should generally feel fine. Again, metabolically, fuel wise, what you're going to be limited by is your muscular endurance. So an easy example of that is, imagine the longest you've ever run is 10 minutes. And if you could somehow run, at a really low heart rate for an hour, what's going to limit you in trying to make that whole hour isn't necessarily going to be fuel. It's going to be just the soreness and the muscle fatigue that comes up. So, as you build those capacities, again, we have, there are athletes that run 100-mile races, 200-mile races. There's mountaineers who are climbing for 12, 20, 30 hours at a stretch, and that by necessity is aerobic. So you can go a very long time. But practically speaking, I think, thinking about, an aerobic session being somewhere between an hour to 2 hours is a functional time frame. Really time limited athletes who are looking at trying to get 15 to 30 minutes in a session, at the very foundation phase, that can be helpful, but you're going to want to look to getting more close to an hour to start creating those sustainable adaptations.
Okay. Next one, is the 220 minus age formula for max heart rate still considered valid?
Yeah, in a similar way. Well, similar and perhaps even more general than that maximal aerobic function number. Yeah. It's an algorithm based on a large data set. So it can work. I don't find much usefulness in defining an athlete's max heart rate. I mean, you can use it in thinking about a percentage of that max heart rate being your different zones that you train in. But what I think is more valuable is trying to target what we call the two ventilatory thresholds. So the first one is that aerobic threshold that I mentioned, and then the second ventilatory threshold is also known as the anaerobic threshold, or the maximum lactate steady state. There's lactate threshold is another term that's been used, and it's this point at which you're effectively producing more lactate through carbohydrate metabolism than your body can reabsorb. And so that's really what sets this ticking clock on your output once you get above that. So I've found, more so than trying to define an athlete's max heart rate is to hone in directly through pretty straightforward field tests, those two boundaries. And from there, we can define all the parameters for training and intensities that we need.
Okay. And this next one is around, so our missions can call for different equipment. So your pack weight can vary from mission to mission. So applying that into your training, depending on the mission, should you be training to the maximum or interval training with the max with a percentage of weight for maintenance days?
That's a great question. I think there's a benefit to doing a little bit of both. So if you know, for instance, that you're going to have a 70-pound pack, and I think about, an analogous situation. So somebody trying to climb Denali, for instance, Denali is a mountain that requires big, heavy packs, and we want to make sure that those athletes who are going to go and climb Denali are capable of carrying that big, heavy pack. But at the same time, it's really difficult, if not impossible, to train foundational speed of movement with a big pack. And so what's helpful is to think about, okay, that's, on a given mission, you're going to be carrying 60 or 70 pounds. But what you also want to have is an ability to move quickly with that weight. And before you can move quickly with that weight, you need to be able to move quickly without that weight. And so spending, especially in the early phases of your training, a lot of time with less or no weight, whether it's hiking or trail running or something, to develop your speed of motion, and then gradually add load onto those activities while monitoring your intensity and keeping it sufficiently low. So you're going to have to slow down, will help carry a portion of that speed along with you, even as you add load. And so if you're thinking about, what your training looks like near to that, eventual hypothetical mission carrying the weight, you might have a couple sessions in the week where you're carrying that full weight and you're going for several hours. And that's a really specific workout, right? That's sort of the pinnacle of specificity. Is you're going to go out, you're going to put on 70 pounds and all of the anticipated mission gear, and you're going to hike for 3 hours on similar terrain. That's a specific workout. Other sessions during the week may be unweighted, so that you can keep maintaining that speed of movement that you want to have underneath that. So it's a little bit of both, but yeah, the question definitely attends to the right thing, which is you want to be able to ultimately carry the weight you need.
Okay. And any tips on decreasing stress on your knees during hiking or impact sport training?
Yeah. There are, a number of different things. I think, I touched on some of them with, the idea of mobility and really working gently through ranges of motion, including at the knee joint without impact loads, right? So you're standing and you're doing standing, dropping down into a squatting position with your heels on the ground to wherever you're comfortable, wherever you feel the limitation. And if you need, you can hold on to a chair in front of you or a table leg to kind of hold yourself stable in that deepest position you can hold, and gradually increasing that range of motion. That's going to support knee health in the sense that now you're improving its range. You're bringing synovial fluid to that joint and maintaining and improving its health. The next step up from that is adding load to those motions. So strength work in the gym, where you're moving through a range of motion. Now you're loading the muscles that support that joint. And ultimately, those are the things which protect it. We can't, we're not training the ACL or the MCL. We're not training those components within the joint. We're training the muscles around it to support it, so that, if the worst thing happens, if you stumble, the load isn't immediately getting shocked into the ligament. It's being restrained. It's being sustained by the muscle itself. So mobility, strength, and then when you're actually out doing things, I think being really conscientious of form. You know, if you're a trail runner, being really attentive to how you're running downhill. I think all of us have probably experienced, you run uphill or you hike uphill and it feels great and you feel like you're working, and then you turn around and you have to descend down that long trail, and the next day your legs are just wrecked and maybe your knees are sore. And that's because of a number of things. It's one, moving downhill, your impact forces are higher because gravity's pulling you down. And those eccentric loads on the muscles can be really taxing. Those, you know, it's a higher, a more rapid movement. It's a fast twitch muscle action. The other thing, though, is to take that example of moving downhill in a running form, is we tend to lean backward when we do that. We tend to sort of want to restrain the speed and get back, and so we are putting more load through our joints and through our structure when we do that, which can be deleterious over the long run. So really being attentive to how you're moving, whether it's ski touring or hiking up and downhill or running, cycling, you know, all of these different movements have a correct form and technique. And it's really valuable to pay attention to that as much as you're paying attention to your aerobic capacity and your strength, because the more efficient you can be movement wise, then that's going to pay big dividends in the activity itself and in supporting things like the knee joint.
Great, thank you. And we are at time. So again, thank you very much, Sam. Really appreciate you joining us for this third Thursday and all of the great information. Thank you everyone for joining us. With that being said, everyone have a great evening. If there's any content you'd like to see us cover in Third Thursday, please reach out to me directly, or if you have a significant mission debrief you'd like us to cover in a future session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.